Yeah, this is a FOMO stock.
Yeah.
Don't miss
Fair
it.
enough.
There'll be shifts and turns, but yeah, the arc of this is it's really rare that you get this kind of an upside potential. And if the basic level of confidence is there, this is a great thing to have in your portfolio because the upside is huge.
Okay, hey Gabriel, thanks for coming in. Good to see you at Deal Night. This is kind of a part two to that where I felt like we had a great overview of what you guys are doing, but obviously Spatial Web, COSM, everything you guys are developing is like it's a dense subject. So I figured it requires more than 10 minutes. So I'm excited to meet with you again, dig into more of this. So first off, thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Kevin. Glad to be here.
And in case somebody perhaps, hasn't watched the video recording of Deal Night, doesn't know what VERS does, do you want to just start us off with a bit of an introduction as to what it is you guys are doing? What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, at the highest level, VERS is really an AI company. We're focused on this next generation of computing, which is called contextual computing, which is right at that intersection of artificial intelligence and Internet of Things, sensors and robotics, cameras and smart home devices. That contextual computing is really about these devices needing to understand the context under which they're operating. And this applies very specifically, and in our case, our target market is in the industrial space. So supply chain and logistics focus, where you want to use the power of artificial intelligence to do something like route a warehouse worker through 100,000 or million square foot facility in the most intelligent way, the fastest route to the right product, and get them in and out, and so that we can kind of get everything that we want next day shipped to our front door. And the warehouse is really the squeeze point, this multi-trillion-dollar logistics industry. And so that's broadly what VERS is as a company, and what our core focus is here as our first target market.
So I want to get into, Wayfinder and COSM, everything you're building, but where I really wanted to start out is it seems like what you guys are developing it's kind of like when I was pitched blockchain for the first time, or when somebody was pitched the internet for the first time. Like, it's something that you're building a framework, a platform that a lot of things are going to be built on top of. So I want to make sure that people watching, and frankly myself, I really want to make sure that we understand the scale and the scope of what you're trying to do. So let's talk about the internet when it was first created, HTTPS, and what you guys are going now with this, what is it? Hyperspace Transfer Protocol. Did I get that right? HSTP?
Hyperspace Transaction Protocol, HSTP.
So can we talk about where that functionality ends and where what you're building begins? Like, what is the big step change that this creates?
Yeah, well, probably the best place to start is with a sort of a bit of a background framing. So the internet is essentially connected computers, and it uses the TCP/IP protocol with IP addresses and TCP to basically transmit communications between computers. This was the basis for email that had related protocols like SMTP, which is Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, and others, right, which we all kind of roughly remember from the early 90s or so. The internet actually was born in 1969, and so it came out of ARPANET, and it was work that was being done with DARPA, the defense group. That then, on top of that, the World Wide Web was formed. And so a different set of protocols was built on top of that. We're a little more familiar with those. HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It was a way to essentially embed a link into what we call hyperlinks, right, into text, and then link that to another address. So instead of having IP addresses for computers, we had web addresses for documents. So the difference is, there's a network of computers, that's the internet. There's a network of documents, that's the World Wide Web. And that runs on top of the internet. We use the DNS because we actually kind of know, Amazon.com is a URL, it's a web address, but the IP address is 192. Blah, 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 right? And the DNS acts as this phone book that kind of connects the two. So you actually have the internet and the web on top of it. What started happening the last 15 years ago, really since the emergence of the smartphone, was that the computing we started doing wasn't just in our offices or on our desktops, on our personal computers, etc., the computing started to happen in the world with us. So we had GPS tracking our location, right? And so you have like cameras with artificial intelligence that are starting to be able to look out into the world, or smart sensors that can tell when the temperature has gone up or down and then adjust accordingly. So suddenly computing is taking place in the real world environment. This precipitated the concept of the next era of computing, or the next era of the web, which we call the spatial web. What's the difference? Instead of it being a web of pages, it's a web of spaces. So it's this idea that the spaces that we live in today are connected through all these different digital systems that are sensing, understanding, tracking, various activities. And increasingly that's going to include holographic information. And so there'll be virtual spaces and there'll be real world spaces with virtual objects in it. Then there'll just be devices that are sensing the real environment, the temperature, the lighting, the movement, the activity. And, a Tesla is part of this, right? So it's sensing the world in around it. It's building a sort of three-dimensional model of that world, and it's able to then speed up and slow down depending on the activities that are happening. So increasingly that means that the computing has moved into the world around us. That's the spatial web, more or less, right? It's the web of spaces. And it's this intersection of the digital and the physical domains together. And so what we're doing as a company is we've developed these next generation protocols like TCP/IP, like HTTP and others that not only help, not just like HTML helps describe the format of a page, but describe the objects in a room, right? With their location, their position, their texture, their color. They're more like a game engine. And then HSTP, so that connects and allows communication between different objects from different spaces in the real world. And so mediated by digital systems, other sensors and tracking devices and what have you. So that's really the idea, is that the spatial web ends up being this intersection of the digital and physical, and it's kind of like these smart spaces start to emerge. What VERS has done is we've invented those initial protocols, our core team. We donated them to the IEEE, which is really the largest standards body in the world for everything, well, starting with electricity and then electronics, and then most of what we call the web or the internet today runs on their standards. So Wi-Fi, as an example, which we're probably both using today, works in a standardized way. So every manufacturer in the world can build radios that then work on those frequencies, and they know how they can plan and forecast ahead because they rely on these standards. So we've done the same thing with these ways of describing multi-dimensional spaces, objects in those spaces, their various activities and movements and permissions. And so that's going through a process now with about 100 different members from around the world, representatives from governments and large Fortune 500s and ethics groups and economic groups like the Federal Reserve are all in there helping to refine and then ultimately ratify this as a de facto standard. In our expectation, because we showed up with about 80% of that work done, we think it'll be done in about 18 to 24 months. Meanwhile, we've been building COSM, which is kind of like an operating system layer on top of those proto versions of the standards which we invented, and then a series of few applications that we can immediately monetize in the supply chain space and in the smart city and mobility space with a project with the European Commission to basically define the flight lanes for drones across 5 countries in Europe. And so there's 3 levels. There's the protocol layer. We build that. That's just can you even make all this stuff interoperable and work, and can you describe 3-dimensional reality in a way that computers can understand? Yes, that becomes standardized. The platform layer, which is our COSM platform, which we've just been using internally to develop our own AI-powered applications, because what this does is it helps you describe the world, the human world, and the world of physics and the world of human, say, knowledge and social systems in a way that AIs can more easily understand and act on. And then build applications that are AI driven, that understand the context under which they're supposed to execute, and therefore can perform activities in ways that are relevant to physical environments, but also, say, respecting certain sort of social policies or laws that are quite critical as we start to think of autonomous cars today, right? And their ability to follow the rules of the road is that lives are dependent on that. Right now, there's a handful of cars, and you keep your, put your hand on the wheel of your Tesla for 30 seconds. But fast forward 10 years from now, you're going to have a significant number of cars just driving by themselves. So we want to make sure that all these activities are able to be digitally, that any laws that are relative to these digital things or kind of phygital things is enforceable. And so that's a big part of essentially being able to create this new language for this next era of not only computing, but kind of our world. So yeah, it's a big idea.
So, okay, so tell me if my simple mind has the generally correct idea, but the way that we have the way that we transfer data now on the internet is whether it's a TikTok video, a recipe, or a research paper, you're kind of just moving data from one place to another and back and forth and sharing this around the world. But as you guys develop this new standard going forward, it's moving data around, but it's data that it's much more rich with context, and it understands a lot more about who's sending it. I looked at this map. It was like this web that I looked at, and it was all the different contextual points you look at. And at first, the first thing I thought of is, okay, spatial data, knowing, the height of a drone or where it's flying and looking at its flight path. And instead of looking at your Uber map and seeing your driver, taking a wrong turn and coming around like this, it's now three-dimensional, and it includes, height and all of that. So that I was surprised to hear is just literally one context point of, I think it was like 10 different points of context. Can we maybe talk about that and like what other kind of specific context do you look for and do you transfer to make this data so much more rich and usable? I guess.
Yeah. What if I would like to know as a manufacturer the average temperature of a certain component of all the refrigerators that I've sold in the last 5 years in a certain region? Would that help me make a better refrigerator? Right? Just that's another dimension of point of context. If you think about, so what is context in a layman's term? Context is who, what, when, where, how. And then why, maybe either the reason you're asking those questions or the result of those questions, right? But it's more or less, we know that this is reporter, kid reporter 101, right? And so this idea that what you want the complete context of something requires you to ask all of those questions. So how many who's are involved in that situation? How many what's? Right? And what level of what? And then when and where? And if you imagine like an answer to anything, if I omit one of those points, you're not getting enough context, or you're not getting the whole context. So, well, this thing happened to this person. When did that happen? 100 years ago, 10,000 years ago. Oh, where did it happen? Oh, it happened over here. Well, if I know where it happened and what happened, but I don't know who it happened to, I'm missing something. Now, the more that you can ensure that information is available, and right now these are in various different systems. Basically, every major corporation is suffering from this today because they have systems that track certain things. I'll give you a very specific example. There's a cold storage provider that's like the largest cold storage distributor in North America. And they, every frozen strawberry or chicken you've gotten probably has come through one of their facilities, like multi-billion-dollar company. They have a problem that most companies in their space have. And in the logistics space, this is kind of a dirty secret no one talks about. And it's called activity-based costing. And what that means is today, that company, they charge all their customers essentially the same price based on kind of size and weight of storage. But their number one cost is not storage, it's energy, because it's a frozen and refrigerated. So whether something's in the frozen section or refrigerated section for X amount of time could be a 50% differential, right? And then there's other factors. They've got 400 different facilities. There's different insurance costs on buildings and equipment. There's different taxation considerations for different regions. There's different liability risks with the kind of materials coming in and out of there. There could be overtime hours. That data is sitting in one of, let's say, 6 different systems that they might have, but those systems do not all talk to each other. There's no obvious integration point. So I need to get information from this that's tracking all the amount of energy that's being used in this facility, but I need to be able to slice it up by the areas that I'm using that energy. This is refrigerated, right? So I need to know coordinate data, and I don't even have that data. I might have GPS data. I know where the long elevation of this facility is versus that one. Okay, so that helps, but that's over in this system. That's about a maps. This system over here is like what we use for our ERP or all of our HR and staffing. So all my cost information on who's working in the facility is over in this system. and so on and so forth, right? So you've got like all these different, then this is our sales data, and this is our inventory system, this is our warehouse management system, and none of these things are designed to talk to each other, and there's no canvas that is uniform for all of them. What happens is when you start making digital twins, you add that spatial context you talked about as a starting point. And then you can anchor those geographically, say, oh, here's the inside of this building, and here's the different sections and regions and locations inside the facility. Here's where this equipment is. Here's where this one is. Here's how cold it is over here. Here's how cold it is over here. You suddenly start to be able to do something profound. So in this case, they do $5 billion a year. And I asked them, how much money do you think you're losing by not being able to do activity-based costing? And they said 10 to 20%.
No way. Wow.
Yeah. Which makes sense. Like if you had to just guess and just say, we're going to treat everyone exactly the same because we just don't know how to connect all the dots here. Yeah, that would be you probably guess 10 to 20%. So, but they could be losing $1 billion a year by just not being able to do this. So by just thinking of each of these data points, as you mentioned, as different dimensions of information, if there was a way to bring those various dimensions into context. Now, I can tell you something really interesting. If you walked into one of those facilities, you could see with your eyes where everything was located. If I told you to close your eyes, you'd have a pretty good sense after walking around the facility where kind of roughly things are. If I showed you, here's the frozen section over here, and then I told you, here's the refrigerator section, I said, walk in this one and walk in this one, you could tell that the one was colder than the other one, maybe by even rough to 50%. Why? Because you're a massive sensory system that's able to build a three-dimensional model in your head, reference the names and types of objects, understand where they come from and what they're made of, right, et cetera, and then identify the differences. But there isn't sensors in that environment that are designed to do that, and so they can't do that, right? And so that's really when you start to think about the power of Internet of Things and sensing these various different attributes. And like I say temperature, and people could go like, well, what would you use that for? Well, that's what you use it for, right? Obviously, that could be applied to what is the total amount of carbon usage coming from all of their various facilities? If the state of California, which might have a handful of their facilities, or in Vancouver, or in Toronto, or Florida, or what have you, they need to do carbon accounting for Canada, and they need to do it for the United States. And if we're going to ever hit these kinds of goals that we're talking about at the global level, you have to be able to have partners that in business that understand how much energy they're using and what those offsets might be related to that, in order to create incentives in the economic system to then say, hey, can you, if we could save these guys 20% by activity-based costing, but they could reduce their energy by 15%, that would, and then get carbon credits against that, they would be making a lot more money, and we would actually be a little closer to our carbon goals, right? Our climate moderation goals. So these are little things that can grow to become very big things. But that's sort of one interesting example of you solve the data interoperability and data integration problem by saying, where's the who, what's the what, where's the where, where's the when, right? So how cold is what where? Wow. That starts to tell you more than they know today.
So it's all of this massive amount of context that I guess as like a human, you kind of forget how intelligent of a machine we are, even the dumb ones. But taking a computer, like talking to a chatbot, like a customer service chatbot, you quickly realize how unintelligent artificial intelligence typically is. Like the limitations are like pretty obvious pretty quickly.
Like Siri's really stupid, but Apple's a $1 trillion company. Like I can't ask a follow-up question.
Get mom and dad to talk to Siri, and then you're like, oh wow, that's actually not that smart at all. Has no idea. So it's like what I think of is the amount of data that must need to be processed to have this kind of context. Though, like it must be massive. It must be a huge. Like, do we have the infrastructure to process this kind of data exchange yet?
It's kind of interesting. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is most likely. There's a little thing called Moore's Law. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's the idea that the cost of compute power doubles. The cost of compute power is cuts in half as it doubles every 18 months. So compute power essentially doubles, but the cost of that gets cut in half. And so that's why, we have 5G networks, and we've got serious cloud computing capabilities. And the power of the iPhone today is more than all the computing power that sent us to the moon. I mean, that's in anybody's pocket, right? It's like a multi-billion-dollar Cray computer, for $1,000. It's like there you go. There's your math, right? Billion to 1,000. So that's one thing we kind of look at when we look at can it scale. The other thing related to this is that it turns out that there's a generic set of ways of describing context that doesn't need to describe all the specifics in order for you to understand a lot about it. Let's see. So when I was a kid, there was a game called Mad Libs. Mad Libs was this little word game on a page, and you wrote, and basically it would say like, noun went to noun and blah blah verb, adjective. And so it's like these funny little stories that you'd write in and you'd fill it in. Now whether you said, Jane went to work on a horse, that was sassy, or something else, the context essentially of the main functions of that sentence were the same, right? So the way that nouns, verbs, and adjectives and prepositions work fundamentally give you what we call an invariant structure. So if there's an invariant structure, meaning the structure of space-time doesn't change, up and down still are up and down for a person that's dealing with gravity on the planet, left and right are always left and right, but they're relevant to your perspective or they're relevant to another perspective. But you can codify that. You can then do some amazing things. Just to give you some perspective, like, computers compute on essentially zeros and ones, right? It's a binary system. But today in the English language, we have how many letters in the English language? 27? I think it's 27 letters.
I have no idea. I believe you.
So A-E-I-O-U plus 21. So that's why I have 26. So with just those letters, you're able to construct every word in the English language, right? So if you just have now they're just using a handful of basics like nouns, verbs, prepositions, adjectives, whatever, of which there are a handful of parts of a sentence. You can construct any kind of a sentence. So if you can break things down to certain sort of basic components, which we've done, like we do this in the what we call hyperspace modeling language. How do you model reality with this language? And it turns out that there's really simple things, and I'll give you one right now just as an example. Everything that happens that we can say happened is what we could define as an actor performing an activity on an asset in space over time. So something does something to something else in space over time. So that's always the case. That's never not the case. Even if the thing is yourself, even if the thing is something that hits something else, laws of motion type stuff, something is performing a change. Now some of those state changes could be like Gabriel moves his Apple, AirPods from point A to point B, right? So I move it in physical space over time. And we could track and say this happened between 1:30 and 21 seconds, 1:30, 22 seconds, right, on such and such day. But I'd also say these are now Kevin's. And so now I've moved them in a different kind of space. Like I've moved them in ownership space. I moved it from a point that's me to a point that's you, and it's binary, right? Now we can say like, what's the price of versus stock right now? What space is that moving in? It's like some sort of economic or financial space. It's not moving in three-dimensional spaces, but that's a dimension. It's an important dimension. It's one we track. It's moving from here, this temperature space, right? From here to there. Okay, fine. Financial space from here to there. And you say, well, how about this is the main one we look at all the time, money over time, right? So I want to know how much money over time. So I'm willing to take less money sooner, but I want more money, more money later, because the value of time is another relationship too, right? So everything's an actor performing an activity on an asset in space over time. And that very simple, there's your kind of, your who, what, when, where, and how are details of that kind of a concept.
So with all of this data, so okay, now I want to dig into COSM. So I guess this is your first flagship product. Probably this aspect will be a little bit easier for people to wrap their heads around. So it's an operating system where it extends much further than the capability of Android on mobile, Mac OS, Windows. It's kind of this next iteration that you guys, quote unquote, it's allows for true AI. So if I understand this correctly, this true AI is basically artificial intelligence that has so much extra context, like you were just explaining, that it's now approaching like a human level of intelligence. I'll say approaching because I understand we're a complex machine. So it's this really intelligent version of a machine, basically. So if we were to talk about digging into COSM and basically some of the key differentiators from that and an operating system that people might sign into, right now to watch this, for example. So can we talk about like COSM and what exactly it is and what your plan is for it?
The short answer is that operating systems standardize access to certain resources on a computer. So all the files and folders and libraries, user management, so that anyone that develops an application on top of that operating system has standard ways with which to access, certain things on it. So it might need to access certain drivers. It needs to access the CPU. It needs to access, files and data. When we move from the PC to the smartphone, the kinds of things we needed to access from a data perspective were essentially the same. Find me a file, find me this, find me that. The location of those might be that they're on the device or that they're in the cloud. And so we'd have to use the network for certain resources. But the big difference was that where on a computer, the things connected to your computer might be like your mouse and your keyboard and a printer, right? Those are kind of like what we used to call peripheral, but just think of like these are the external things of parts. The monitor is not the computer, right? It's just a monitor. When we move to the smartphone, they have to change the operating system for a handful of reasons. Number one, you're not using a keyboard and a mouse. You're using touch. You're swiping, pinching, zooming. It's a whole different interface for input, right? The output is still the screen, except the other inputs are like GPS or like gyroscope or accelerometer. So it knows like, oh, you're moving from point A to point B. Okay, great. On top of that, what do we get? Uber, DoorDash, Airbnb, Google Maps, like just adding GPS and having the accelerometer be able to tell like whether you're going slower or faster, you're walking, you're driving, don't interrupt me while I'm driving. Like, these are all features of different set of inputs. It's not just a keyboard or a mouse, it's a sensory input. GPS, sensory input. Talk to the satellite, figure out where you are relative to your location. Wow, amazing. Camera was another input, right? And obviously then voice became another input. We didn't used to talk to our PCs, we talked to our phones. Right? Okay, so the inputs change, then the outputs change as well, and then it became more of a networked device instead of this sort of just device. Now, the types of programs that people would write for a Windows or a Dell machine in the 80s, maybe there was a handful of companies and people, and there was a handful of programs, maybe 1,000 that were usable in total. When the smartphone came out, Apple and then Android released what's called the SDK, the Software Developer Kit, and it went from nobody being able to develop applications on a smartphone, like Apple was the only one in the first year, to then 500 in year two when they announced the App Store, and to like 5 million apps today, right? Billions of downloads. And so operating systems allow a whole new way of interfacing with third-party devices and objects with standard ways of accessing information and managing users and permissions, that kind of stuff. And it allows for developers to start developing applications. So what kind of applications can you develop on a smartphone? Millions, right? Angry Birds, Chase Bank app, right? MyFitnessPal or whatever, so the total number. Now that's the same operating system. They didn't change. There's nothing different or new or added that's like biasing one of those or the other. So that the additional capabilities are things that people add. Now what's happening is we've gone from the personal computing era to the mobile computing era, and now we're moving to the contextual computing era. In the contextual computing era, computing has gone into the world around us. But if you have a smartphone, a smart home set of devices today, you know that none of them work together, hardly at all. And you have to have 5, 6, 7, 8 different apps on your phone because they can't communicate. Why? Because they're not able to share context with each other. What I would like is that when my smart lock, I'd like the sensors to know that my smart lock to know, or my cameras know when I leave the house to automatically lock and then to adjust the temperature accordingly. And then I'd like them to actually know when I'm on my way home. I'd love if my Tesla could tell them so that it could cool the house down. So the time I walk in, it's cooled down. Impossible to do that today. So the kinds of things that you can do with COSM is build applications where context sharing can be shared. The who, what, when, where, how of anything can be shared with any other device on the network. And so whether that's temperature, whether that's location, or whether that's position, or whether that's who, like if I'm out of town, my wife might prefer a different temperature, right, etc. You could start to say, well, I would love it if my refrigerator and my doctor both got information from when I'm working from my iWatch from when I'm working out. Or that my smart refrigerator was updating my trainer on what I've purchased and what goes in there, right? And so I don't have to send it to them in a text. So it allows you to use AI to start automating, contextualizing, and then automating all this data sharing in these really powerful ways, of which then you could really develop a 1,000,001 applications for. So I can give other examples, but that's just kind of a bit of a background context for how you do that. So it's not so much about bringing human level intelligence and sort of like a Ultron or Terminator or sort of AI in the network that's run amok kind of thing. It's more like, can you just make the network of things that we're interacting with, the information, the content, the activities, become more seamless and interoperable and act intelligently, right? I'd like to be able to walk in and out of every restaurant or grocery store or place of business in Vancouver or in Toronto or in Los Angeles or New York or London and Dubai in the exact same way that I jump in and out of an Uber or an Airbnb, where there's no payment transaction. I've got an ID, and that ID basically follows me around. I've got an account that's on file, and everywhere I go, I just go in and eat, and I go, And so these kind of contextualization of information allows for intelligent automation and adaptive automation. That's the benefit of context, is that you can start to automate not just individual things, but across things. So the shift is in contextual computing era is not just about changing and not an operating system just for a single device, but an operating system that allows communication across any number of these different devices and applications in creating more of an intelligent network.
Right. Well, the big aha for me was when you first explained Wayfinder. Wayfinder? Yeah, that's correct. So as a recap for those who are watching, so there's the protocol level where you guys are, you publish that paper with the IEEE, and the plan is saying, hey, we've got this new way of moving data around that requires a ton more context, and this is what kind of the protocol. Then on top of that, you built COSM, which is the operating system, saying this is how you can actually essentially build apps based on this new protocol. And then the killer app, the first one that you guys have developed, is called Wayfinder, and that's the logistics app, which, I mean, for anybody watching, technology background or not, this is one that makes so much sense. Can you explain Wayfinder and then dig into the NRI example? Because again, that's just something that it clicked. It makes so much sense, and especially when we're tying this back to revenue and growing and where does the stock price go, Wayfinder is just a fantastic example.
Yeah, so the irony was we started developing the capabilities for COSM, and we were thinking through the lens of what's the ultimate use case. And the ultimate use case is a smart city, right? So by 2050, 70% of humans are expected to be in one of these mega cities. It's why there's all these smart city projects and investments that are starting to happen in the billions of dollars. Now, in order to make cities smart, where mobility and transportation is happening in intelligent ways and government services are happening, you're able to walk in and out of those, those restaurants and those grocery stores, grab what you want, and all that sort of ways that we might imagine. I guess like the white mirror version of Minority Report kind of stuff, right? In order for that to work, you need to have a whole bunch of systems working together, and you need to have this contextual understanding of the environment. You also need a place where humans, machines, and AI are able to synchronize and work together. You know what looks just like a city? The inside of a warehouse. So we actually picked logistics for two reasons. One, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry with significant challenges that's very hard to digitize activities in the real world. Easy to digitize, publishing and media and finance. Like those were disrupted by the internet, like fairly easily, right? But to do that in warehouses and ports and construction sites and manufacturing facilities is extremely difficult. So we wanted to pick something really difficult with a huge total addressable market that was kind of a little sandbox for what we felt the ultimate use applications would be served for. Why? Because you look at a warehouse, it's got a docks coming in, and essentially they're like a port. So you take like any port city around the world. It's like I'm here in Los Angeles. You've got the Los Angeles Harbor, you got the ports in Long Beach, and everything comes in and out of these locations. Well, every warehouse has these docks that are essentially like ports, right? Everything comes in and out through these locations. Then what do you have? Essentially rows and rows that are streets with large towers with addresses on them. It's just with buildings. And then you've got humans and machines moving in and out and all around these things. You've got pallet drivers and forklifts, and you've got humans, and you've got, stops, who can go when. It's a very much kind of a little microcosm of a city. You also have robotics systems in there. So some things are human driven, some things are robotics driven, et cetera. And so what we want to do is say, what happens if we could create a shared context that AI could really use to thrive here? The problem that we identified is that 90% of warehouses are actually mostly driven by human labor. It's low wage, low paid work, and you're essentially wandering a warehouse for 8 to 10 hours a day trying to find something. I joke that it's like being lost in IKEA as your job. It's a tough job, and it takes a couple months to get good. If you're working at 100,000 or a million square foot facility, like how do I remember where everything's at? Because you're essentially just getting a string of text, SKU number, go find row G, section L, aisle 9, and then find this object, and you get there, and it's people being lost like for a while. The turnover rate is like up to 100% annually. So there's a massive labor shortage in a market where warehouses are growing exponentially. Everything is moving towards e-commerce, as we all know. Even COVID accelerated this, and so there's a real problem with training people, trying to keep them, have them find the product that you want next day on your doorstep, right? And so what we did is we figured out that in the same way that Google Maps and other services built out, applied addresses to coordinate data and put it on maps, that then you would route an Uber driver or DoorDash driver, Postmates or whatever, route themselves through a city, and that you could more or less put an Uber Lyft driver up against a cabbie in Manhattan, and within no time, the Uber driver will beat the cabbie. They don't need to know where any of the buildings are. They don't need to know the neighborhoods. The AI knows, right? Essentially, it's dynamically routing them. It's letting them know if there's traffic. And so we've done that same thing. We applied it to the inside. So instead of a 2-dimensional map, we build a 3-dimensional map. With addresses are not just on the ground, but addresses are different levels, different stories, because the object you might be looking for is above you and below you, to the right or left. We mapped all the inventory information. These are shoes, these are dresses, these are hats, to each of those locations. So it's like we put the intelligence of those objects into those 3-dimensional addresses. We use the Spatial Web protocols, which give us Spatial Web addresses. Instead of IP addresses for computers or web addresses for pages, they're 3-dimensional addresses that you can define any space or point in space or location, right? And then you say, well, what's at that location? Well, okay, these hats are in that location. Then you can just put it on a 2-dimensional handset, and the worker just uses the AI, and the AI tells them, given where you are right now, should you go left or right or straight or backward or forward, and then just routes them directly to that. And what we've seen from that, now having deployed it, 15 different locations with over 10 million picks, and now having 1,000 workers operating on it, is consistently 35 to 50% productivity gains. That resulted in just a massive multi-million-dollar savings for our customer.
Wow.
That then resulted in a significant, $34 million contract for us. It was a 10-year contract because it's just unprecedented in that space. And since then, we've attracted all kinds of large Fortune 500 companies. Every warehouse has a variation of that same problem. And so Wayfinder has been this amazing first application where you have the spatial context, you have the semantic understanding of the product that you're looking for. It knows where you are relative to that location, and the warehouse management system basically just says, "Hey, go get this," and then we intelligently route them and we update their systems. And so that's been a real triumph for that very first step. And it's just the first raindrop, when I think in a big storm that's coming from us, and you're going to see a lot of announcements over the next few quarters here with larger partners and resellers and channel distributors that want to bring that sort of spatial intelligence and AI-driven applications for warehouses, into that industry. And so that's been a great place for us to start and really demonstrate the viability, even just from a purely economic perspective, of the power of bringing these kinds of solutions into the market.
So if I got the numbers correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something like you guys, because of the efficiency gains, you said 35 to 50%, you saved them like $8 million a year, something like that. You saved them 8, and then they paid you 2 of that, something two and a half of that, and so they still come out more than $5 million ahead a year, even after paying you guys. So it's the definition of win-win. So
it's either don't use us and lose $5 million a year, right?
Exactly.
And so that was why they. We approached them with a $5 million 5-year contract, which is pretty standard. And they said, "What happens after year 5?" And we said, "Well, we're probably undercharging you, so we'll come back and charge you much more." And they said, "Well, can we just sign a 10-year contract?" First customer, absolutely.
So first app, first customer. It's already a $35 million Canadian for you watching. So it's at 25 US, something like that. And that's one that's one warehouse provider. There's got to be a million. Yeah. There's got to be many thousands out there that you could theoretically. Now, for some other company to come and try to do something similar, the first thing I hear is you guys developed the standard, you built the first operating system, you built the first app. So you must have multi-year lead time on anybody being able to even attempt at trying to do something similar. Am I kind of on the right track, or? Yeah,
we probably have a 4 to 5 year lead on people. What's happened is every time we've encountered a potential competitor, they just want to figure out how to work together. So
sure.
Let's say I can't talk about them. The one of the largest, we've got 5 pilots right now with large Fortune 500 companies that are all using aspects of COSM and Wayfinder that are focused in the logistics and supply chain space. But they're also manufacturing companies and expanding into now even retail. Same problems, right? It's basically trying to find something in space, whether or not it's like, where's the one white car that came off the manufacturing line that was supposed to be in section 12, but someone moved to section 7, and we're supposed to get it out of here like yesterday, but every day costs us thousands of dollars. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem for literally just manufacturers that lose their cars in their own facilities because it's 1 million square feet, and you can see the curvature of the earth from one side to the next, right? It's huge. And so, that's a similar problem. It's also very similar to like the drone work we're doing with the European Commission, where it's not take this actor, right, and have them, the activity is go find this item and pick it and take it and move it over here. It's go perform this security check of this building, but you're not allowed to fly over you have to fly this very specific route, or you can't take this. You can fly any route, but you can't fly higher than this height, or you can't fly over these buildings. So figure out whichever route you prefer. These are like AI powered drones, right? Fully autonomous drones. So you can see how these are all variations of the same kind of contextual set of problems, where I need direction on really the how and where I can perform a certain kind of activity, whether that's prescriptive or it's prohibitive. Like, you can do whatever you want, just don't go outside this boundary. It's a very specific thing. So like, hey, just traverse this, do security rounds in whichever order you like, but you can't go outside this boundary. That's a very simple sort of like application that could be used. So so Wayfinder has been quite successful. There are many companies. We just made an announcement this week with Tompkins Ventures. Tompkins
Right.
Jim Tompkins is a legend in the supply chain space. Has been for 50 years, written 1,000 articles. Has a network of hundreds of companies, and we want to be able to be sure that we're targeting the right partners in the right order that really fit where we are with respect to the maturity of our technology, especially when you're working with Fortune 500s. It's easy to we want to make sure we're landing and expanding with the right partners in the right way. So that's been another great announcement that came out this week as well. So yeah, we're seeing just phenomenal traction in the space, and I think that the more we get the story out there, the more it seems like investors are being attracted and jumping in.
Well, yeah, clearly. I mean, it's just in the time that I've since we've met at deal night to now. I mean, the stock's been on fire in a market where, frankly, not much is working. Most of my portfolio is not looking so good. So it's nice to see a glimmer of hope. And you guys have done something really fantastic. I know you have lots of interesting companies that in the pipeline. Perhaps we're going to flash a few on the screen here. We talked about at deal night. We can go back to a clip from that. I'm just curious in terms of like how a pilot program works. So like with NRI, for example, how does a pilot program work? You come in, do you have to is there a certain period of time? Hey, like a 3-month test, let us show you what we can do, and then let's negotiate a contract. Like what does a pilot program actually look like?
I mean, in general, pilot programs are about 6 months, but in reality, they can be anywhere from 3 months to a year. So with NRI, we tested for over a year, but it wasn't about closing the customer. It was about even proving to ourselves that the technology really worked. There's a pilot we're about to engage in now, with that cold storage provider that I mentioned earlier, that pilot will probably take less than 4 weeks.
Okay.
So the question I think that related to that investors might be interested in is, as an investor, what are the friction points? Like pilots can convert, they can convert slower or faster. Those are by nature, they're an unknown variable, right? What you want to find is that the opportunity that you're tapping into with the customer is a big problem. It's a scalable problem, right? And so if it takes a little longer to solve that problem, but that results in a significant contract, like with NRI, it's an 8-figure contract, it's worth the time, right? So we kind of have to assess those on a case-by-case basis. More broadly speaking, the goal is to get all these folks over to become not customers of the application, but actually build their own applications on COSM next year. So right now we're the only developers on COSM. We're the bottleneck for the hundreds of companies and many Fortune 500s in our pipeline today that want to start working with our technologies, but we're having to work with them on that. So getting the platform to a certain level of maturity next year really puts us in a position where they can start to scale. So with respect to a handful of these key pilots, we're going to have significant demonstrations, but we're not in the pilot business. So as we move into next year, you're going to see this shift. Even some of these current customers, some of them will convert to contracts, some of them will convert to developers, and they'll build not just one, but 2, but 3, 4, 5 applications over the coming years. And that's where we really get out of we're the friction point at the moment. With respect to getting these warehouses up and running, there's 2 things that you need to do that are the friction points that to scale. Number one is you have to integrate with the warehouse management system. In the case of NRI, they had their own homegrown WMS. And so they're the only user of that. So we spent, 3 months just integrating with that platform. And then we had to build the digital twin, essentially scan the entire warehouse and map all that information. And that took a couple months just by itself. Today, we're in the process of integrating with the two largest warehouse management service providers in the world. They have thousands of customers, one of the biggest retailers and warehouses and third-party logistics and distributors, in the world. You're talking hundreds of millions of square feet. So what that does is that's a one-time friction cost for us, integrate with them essentially one time. And then these customers can get up and running. They themselves would be resellers of our service and then start to onboard those customers. So those customers are even, $5 million a pop for a contract, and you get, 100 of them as opposed to thousands of them, in the next handful of years. You're easily into $1 billion, market cap territory, pretty fast here. So they're not trying to work with us just to get a handful of their customers. They'd like to get a significant number. So it's real. It kind of goes back to the competitive question you were asking earlier. Every time we've come across a competitor, they've more or less wanted to just say, can we integrate what you're doing with what we're doing, and just get the benefits into the business. So, ultimately, that's the first friction point. The second one is building that digital twin. That process originally took us several months. We did a hyper resolution, 3-dimensional centimeter, or so accuracy. And that's like overkill for these environments. So we have it down to, a week now, where the first facility we went into took us, like I said, several months. The last 14 that we did, more or less was get a layout of the floor plan and their inventory map, and we could just extrapolate the whole thing. And we never even went to those locations, and they're operational today. So cool. By this time next year, I expect that warehouses will just be able to upload that stuff right into the COSM platform. Select what they want with their configuration of Wayfinder, either develop their own customizations on top of that, or just get going. And so those kind of friction points, have dropped exponentially even from the beginning. And ultimately, we're not going to be in the pilot business. We're going to be in the platform business. And so that's where I think it's important to do some bootstrapping work, and there's huge land and expand opportunities with these big Fortune 500s. It's also really useful for us to learn, kind of drink our own champagne as we're going through the process here. So it's not just academic and theoretical. And we've been that way the whole time. My chief innovation officer got up at 5 a.m, went down and picked with workers for 6-7 hours a day for months to really understand nuances like, wow. Hey, we're having audio instructions as well, but did you guys realize that 80% of the workers here are Latino and they're Spanish speaking, right? And so there's tons of nuances that happen when you understand the customer in a really important way. Now, we want to be able to do that in such a way that any generalizable capabilities go into the operating system before we roll it out. But ultimately, the customer knows their problems the best, and they're the best one to be able to develop solutions for that at scale. And that's what they're asking us for.
Amazing. Well, Gabriel, I could chat with you all day, and I want to be aware of your time here and not take too much of your time. So to kind of wind this down, and it's funny, I have this behind me, and I didn't actually write this for you. This is it's the core principles that kind of guide our investment decisions. So there's a reason I was asking you the questions I was. Looking at things like, okay, to quickly run through it. Number one, is it a business you understand or like? I mean, that's the purpose of this call, to make it understandable. It's an intense concept topic we're trying to dig into now. So I appreciate you taking the time for myself and the viewers to understand it. But aside from that, unique competitive advantage, that's one of the biggest ones. And you really gave me confidence in that. And I believe you when you say you've probably got a 4 or 5 year head start. I mean, you developed the protocol for something that didn't exist before you guys, and you wrote a book on it as well. So, I mean, you really gave me comfort there. Top quality management, I'll give you a high five on that one. You've certainly persuaded me in that direction. And undervalued, now that's subjective, I mean, but when you're looking at the scope of what you're looking to accomplish and the way that I could see you stacking contracts and the traction you have so far, I mean, I'm really impressed with everything that I've seen. And this is, I mean, clearly I'm not the only one, considering you're the only stock chart I have that's doing this, going the right way. So really impressed by everything I've seen. Very grateful you took the time, not only for deal night, but to chat with me here again. Thank you so much. I hope to chat with you again here. Any kind of final thing you want to leave us with before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your day?
Yeah, this is a FOMO stock.
Yeah.
Don't miss
Fair
it.
enough.
There'll be shifts and turns, but yeah, the arc of this is it's really rare that you get this kind of an upside potential. And if the basic level of confidence, is there, this is a great thing to have in your portfolio because the upside is huge. There's plenty of safer stocks to bet on. But this is one I think to round out a portfolio that also, we'd love to have you come on the ride with us, and so we're super grateful for the opportunity, Kevin, for you to showcase what we're doing here, and looking forward to come back and sharing more good news along the way.
My pleasure. And for anyone watching at home, so VERS trades on the NEO exchange. The ticker symbol is VERS. If you guys have any questions or difficulty buying the stock or anything like that, reach out. We love chatting and helping people out. So you will hear from Gabriel again on this channel. Awesome to have you back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Take care.